is Jessica Pettitt, and I am an out entrepreneur.
Hello, Out Bosses. Rhodes Perry here, and welcome to this week's episode of The Out Entrepreneur, a weekly podcast where I get to interview today's most inspiring LGBTQ bosses crushing it in business. And I am super thrilled to be having a friend, colleague, mentor, a longtime mentor of mine, Jess Pettitt, joining us all the way from Eureka, California. So, Jess, are you ready to inspire fellow Out Bosses?
Hulk smash!
Yes. Awesome. Okay. So a little bit about Jess. She pulls together her stand-up comedy from 15 plus years of diversity trainings in a wide range of organizations to serve groups to move from abstract fears to actionable habits that lead teams to want to work together. With a sense of belonging and understanding, colleagues take more risks with their ideation, conserve precious resources through collaboration, and maintain real connections with clients over time. I like that. I feel like it's almost kind of like a rhyme going on there. So Jess, why don't you kick us off in the interview and tell us a little bit more about your business and what makes it unique?
Sure. So I am a trainer, keynoter, author, speaker, person, consultant that started in straight up diversity, social justice education, and have moved to broad stroke communication, teamwork, really subliminal diversity trainings so that I can capture the people that if it said diversity training, they'd be like, it's a great time to get a cup of coffee. And I've maintained my kind of history and I would say integrity around really deep dive around LGBT issues, race, class, age, size, immigration issues, like very specific pieces to encourage people to have conversations across difference. But before you can do that, you have to do the pre-work of really understanding who and how you are so that we can all do the best we can with what we got some of the time.
Okay, so you're doing a lot and
so many.
You're doing so many things, right? So I think one of the interesting things that I've noticed and just kind of following you over the years is that when you started out in your business, and fill in the blanks if I'm getting anything wrong here, you started out in kind of the social justice frame. You had a business focused on I am social justice, which is kind of like the name tag, I am social justice, which I loved. And since that point, your business has evolved. And now, you know, what I'm noticing just as an outsider is you've kind of pivoted your business almost in that it's good enough now, right? And that might be a spinoff of the book. Can you just talk a little bit about that evolution and maybe talk about where the book fits into your business?
Sure. I think it's really important to know that it was really scary to change the name of my business, change my branding, pivot from the audiences that I had typically been working with that also matched the actual like job, employee kind of work experience I had. So I kind of did all of that at once. But if I'm really being truthful, the pivoting I've been doing forever. So when, before I'm out as a queer person, because I am a late bloomer, I came out when I was 27 to nobody's surprise except my own. But prior to that, I had been doing all of this ally work and ally development and working with primarily heterosexual people about why is this such a big deal? And my master's degree work, et cetera, was on LGBT student identity development in the South. Specifically because there was such a heaviness around like, oh, the South is terrible for this. And I'm like, actually, there's a lot of places that are terrible for this, regardless of where they're geographically located. So then as I shifted and became a much more visible LGBT figure, or L figure, I guess, which is when we initially met, what I realized is in that context, white, gay, and white lesbian, highly educated, upper class folks were super comfortable. So no one else was welcome. And then the racism, classism, sizeism, ageism, religious and political view differences and things like that within the white, gay, and lesbian community wasn't being addressed. I kind of always shift to do the thing that no one wants to talk about because possibly because I'm funny or because I'm charming or I just have access to that table. Yeah. It's kind of like, welcome. Okay, now we're going to talk about something really hard.
Yeah.
So that's kind of still what I do, right? So after being fired a million times, I started my own business. And the original concept of I am social justice was about my responsibility. And interestingly is that the people who didn't like it thought it was ego based, that like, I am social justice. And instead it's like, oh God, I'm social justice, right?
Yeah.
So I tried to really profoundly bring that sense of vulnerability to doing the work. And after 10 plus years of doing it, I burnt out. I wasn't noticing a difference. I wasn't getting any different from my audience, any questions that were different. Moreover, I was not noticing a difference in my own life. And, thank goodness I burnt out like 3 years ago instead of more recently with all the things that are happening now. Like, I think there's a part of me that thinks it might be harder to burn out now, which is a misnomer. People burn out every day. But in my burnout, I was like, well, I guess I just have to go get another job. And I realized at that point I would never be in my own audiences. So I started listening to my audiences and figuring out what is the conversation that nobody's having. And that is that all of us are exhausted. And there hasn't been a lot of progress. There's been some progress, sure. But there hasn't been enough progress for people to feel like their work matters. And that really struck a chord. And our work does matter. And it might not finish. It might not be perfect. But it is certainly good enough.
Yeah.
And then as that happened, the book kind of evolved into, a friend of mine, Mike McCree, said this once at a conference when he was talking with fraternities and sorority members from national offices, not the undergraduate members, is that we all know there's a problem. There is a house on fire. So this is not the time to mow the lawn. Right?
I love that.
Yeah.
I love
so
that.
If we know that there's a house on fire, like a garden hose is probably ineffective.
Yeah.
But it is at least the right activity.
Yeah.
So Good Enough Now kind of happened. Then I wrote the book, and then I really shifted my brand to be a much more subliminal diversity training, because now I'm having conversations with the people who have the power and the resources and have felt very isolated from this conversation. And that's who I'm diving in with.
Yeah. I love that you're being really honest about how in business you're constantly pivoting, right? And that it wasn't just this one pivot this was a big pivot of changing your business's name and branding and all of that. This is what I think a lot of small business owners struggle with, of we're doing this thing and this thing is making us money and we keep doing the thing. And pretty soon we've kind of recreated this almost like 9 to 5, where like you were describing, a little burnt out, maybe just kind of in the everyday, but also in like what you're doing and wondering if you're making an impact. And I think like one thing that I pulled from what you're saying is that you took a pause, you resisted going back into the 9 to 5 of working for someone else, and you honed in on what your audiences were struggling with. Like you were asking those questions and recognizing that there was a gap or this pain point. And you're like, okay, I'm stepping up and now I'm going to think about it. I'm going to thoughtfully process it. And you wrote this amazing book, Good Enough Now, which we'll include in the show notes. And I've read it and I really like it. I like the concept of how you kind of break this down into what motivates an individual to be a change agent, but also just to change themselves. And I would love for you just to, if you can, it's a long book, right? But if you can just kind of describe that construct of what you created, that might be helpful for the audience as well.
Absolutely. So while I was desperately trying to figure out what to do with my life when I was super burnt out, I read 4 books: Difficult Conversations, Crucial Conversations, Courageous Conversations, and Fierce Conversations. And I enjoyed all of them. And I have told all the authors this, so I'm not throwing shade. We can do that later if you want about different things. But I really respected their books, and I felt that kind of the last third, it's either like their publishing deadline was coming up or it just got kind of manipulative-y, salesy, right? So like if Rhodes, you and I are going to have a conversation, basically if we're having a conversation across difference, or that's super important, if I listen to how you talk, I can adjust how I talk so that you can hear what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
And great, that does not sound like a bad place. However, it doesn't take responsibility for why do I talk the way that I talk, right? And so the idea being is that if I can provide space to understand why I show up or how I show up, who and how I am when I show up, if I can do that, I can provide a space or even a sense of grace for myself. That habit I can then apply to you so we can have a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
So my book is divided into 3 sections. And so briefly, good is, I believe innately we are all trying. right? So how are we doing the good that we are doing? And don't invalidate that. Like, don't reformat the entire hard drive. You're doing something awesome. What is that? And then work from a place of strengths. Awesome. The enough section is really like, if you're working from a place of strengths, then there's all that other junk. So instead of getting depressed about all that other junk, you also are annoying and frustrating, right? Because of all that other junk. So enough is paying attention to other people that they're just as frustrating as you are. So that sense of humility can kind of come back, because ultimately we are enough. We have enough tools. We have enough resources to try. And then my last third is really about, now, what can we do to have better connections with one another? How can we intentionally have an opportunity like, this is it. I am actually going to have an intentional conversation that matters right now. And that shifts how we engage, how we listen, how we interact, and how we build relationships, which ultimately impacts how we build community.
Yeah.
And if we do it some of the time, that's good enough.
Yeah. I love that. And I think it's an exercise for leaders in particular around self-awareness, right? To understand, I like the construct of, it's not enough just to meet someone where they're at in their communication style. I like what you were saying about around really thinking thoughtfully around how we show up and how we communicate and what our expectations are for other people. I think about that a lot, and I'm sure other business owners do as well for different reasons. Maybe it's because of the salesy stuff or trying to have an impact. And I think your book really helps think through, ways that you can make better connections. And I think it's valuable, really, really valuable.
I was having a conversation with someone who's a sales manager, supervisor, and she just randomly mentioned, like, I just wish I could have a quick book that could get to sales and psychology and like motivate people to do better. She was having this conversation with someone who's sitting next to me. And so I'm like, do I say something? Do I not say something? And then literally she asked me, she's like, you're a random stranger. What do you think about this? And I said, the best way to increase sales is to work on the salesman, not the customer.
Yeah. Yep.
And she was like, tell me more. But the salesman is part of that business, much longer period than the customer is.
Yep.
So if the salesman or saleswoman or saleshuman can actually be aware of, how do they feel about what they're selling?
Yeah.
How do they feel about the problem that it's solving or the solution that they're selling to their customer? And then how does that fit in with their lived experience? Then they can put it more into their own words and their own experience. Now they're selling the ability to be a solution, which is way more effective than like lowering the price.
Yeah, 100%. In your book too, one of the things that I really liked is kind of what motivates you, what persuades you. And if I'm getting this wrong, definitely jump in. But I think my takeaway was, some people are like the analytical. So it's like you use the term head-centered, right? Yeah. Of like, I need to see the facts. You have to make a case, right? And there's a little bit of me in that, right? And then some people are heart-centered. I need to hear a compelling story about why this matters, and you need to move me in that way. And I think of my partner who is a therapist and she's moved by emotion, like there's more of her in that. And then like the third piece that I really, really identify is like action oriented, like there's something wrong. We have to fix it,? And so I like that you say that we're not monoliths. We're not just one of these things. We're a blend, and, at different moments and different times. And I think that's also helpful, I think, for just being a human and being in the world and understanding what really inspires people to take action.
Yeah. I mean, technically all three variables are in all of us.
Yeah.
Out of habit, we show up in at least one, but probably two of the ways. And then the third one just gets dragged along because that's what fuels all of our excuses. And then when push comes to shove, that's also what motivates us. Like, it was our time in New York that I call the third one the third rail, because that's the part of the subway system. Don't touch it because it'll electrocute you.
Yeah.
But it's also what powers the entire system.
Yeah.
And again, referencing those 4 books, I think they focus a lot on the 2 that you show up, but they don't do a lot of work. And like, my excuses show up.
Yeah.
Right? Like my patterns of like, my fears, my anxieties, when I get frozen, or the need for more information, like all that shows up too.
Yeah.
We can be responsible for how we show up.
Yeah. I have one more question for you just on like the business side. And that is, I often like to ask my guests around what the origin stories are for starting out as an entrepreneur, starting out as a founder, business owner, however you identify. And I know a little bit about your origin story and how you got started. And I think that can be helpful for our guests, many of whom tune in and they're like, I'm thinking about taking the entrepreneurial leap and I'm not sure what's on the other side of that cliff. So can you take us back to before I Am Social Justice got started, the older iteration of your business? Like, what was going on for you at that moment? And what was the spark that just said your internal mind just kind of like, I'm going to do this? Take us back.
Absolutely. So, and I have a therapist, so I can do this safely.
Okay.
So I worked in higher education. My master's was in higher ed administration, and I worked in residence life. And then I started doing specific identity-based work, whether they're connected to multicultural centers or not. We met each other when I was working at NYU. I was the program advisor or the equivalent of the assistant director of the LGBT center there, and then started the LGBT center at Arizona State. And both of those jobs are pretty pivotal to start my own business. Mm-hmm. Two reasons, really. And then I would say later on, with some maturity, I gathered a third one. So don't let me forget that one. But the first one is that I kept getting fired for basically doing my job. Yeah. So there was a pattern of that. And when you are subordinated by someone else being your boss, possibly it's because my parents died when I was young, or because I was super passionate or whatever, but I didn't manage up. Mm-hmm. So if a boss got a haircut, I was the last person to be like, nice haircut, because I have stuff to do. Yeah. I believe that I was really advocating for the agency of the students that I was in charge of working with, which is not necessarily a team player, nor is that managing up. Mm-hmm. Every time I've ever been fired, I would do it all over again. I just might manage up a little better. Yeah. But the realities of being fired from 3 of your first 3 jobs is that's eventually a pattern. And so I'm going to have to pay my bills. I got to figure something out. Yeah. And I was fired from NYU. I was almost fired from Oregon. Technically, I got the new job just in time. Yeah. But I was fired from NYU. And then I was interviewing for Arizona State when I was being fired from NYU. So I immediately transitioned to Arizona State. And I was fired from Arizona State, which was the first publicly funded LGBT center in the state of Arizona, in a horrifically hostile work environment. Yeah. So getting fired from there, I got a severance package. I have always been scrappy and overly employed, like 2 or 3 jobs at a time. And I just said, this is probably the only time I'm ever going to get paid to not work. Mm-hmm. And girl, you got a problem. You keep getting fired. Yeah. So you just figure it out. And right around that time, even though I had been booking programs through my jobs on campus, it never dawned on me that I could be something that gets booked. Yes. And my dad was a serial entrepreneur. Like, I just didn't think about it, right? At all. And literally was in the car, got stuck in traffic in Tempe, Arizona, on the way to my exit interview. And out the passenger window of the car was the National Speakers Association headquarters. Nice. And I was like, what is that? Went to their website and I was like, oh my gosh, people do this for a living? Which is hysterical because I had been paying speakers to come in for years. Yeah. But I went to a chapter meeting and was like, I got 6 months of salary and insurance. I have nothing to lose. And at the time, because I'm old, Facebook was brand new. And at the time, you could only use edu email addresses. Mm-hmm. And so my very first marketing thing is I one post to Facebook. And I just said, I got 6 months. I'll do whatever you want for $500 on your campus. Wow. And then I paid attention to what I got hired for. I saved the flyers and used that language and built a website. And here we are almost 15 years later.
Yeah, I was able to just kind of pull out from what you're describing, like you notice some patterns, you're working for other people, kind of building out these amazing programs. I mean, you were a rock star at NYU from a student perspective, just like that you went to bat. Oftentimes at NYU, I can't even remember, like 2004, 2006, whenever that was. But, you know, like advocating at that time for trans students, 2003 to 2006, right? and just like a force, and getting NYU to protect trans students, having a gender inclusive housing policy. I mean, this was like way before people even knew that trans people existed in a way. And you went to bat for a lot of us in a way that was really meaningful. And aside from that, this just didn't work out for you. It wasn't a fit. And you turned what a lot of people could just stay stuck, and to say, I just can't get a job that I like, and to stay stuck in that pattern. You turned that into an amazing opportunity and saying, all right, what can I learn from this? And what should I do next? And you saw this opportunity and like taking all of your skills, blending it, and building a business that has continued to thrive and change over time. And I think that's really, really inspirational. And I think super inspirational for a lot of folks who are tuning in, where it's like, for folks who haven't started a business yet, just kind of like, how can I take myself? How can I be more authentic in my work and do the things that I love? And I think you're a great example of that. So I just wanted to say that.
Can I say two things on that?
Yeah, definitely.
So first one is, I believe anybody can do this. It is the hardest thing I have ever done. The only thing harder than having a crappy boss is realizing you are your crappy boss.
Yeah.
And like that, because you can't blame it on anybody else, right? Yeah. And then the only thing crappier than having really bad employees is realizing, oh, that's me too, right?
Yep.
And then for years, the only sounding board I had were my dogs. And they're expensive because they like every idea.
Yeah.
Right? With that said, anybody can do this if you ultimately believe what you're doing matters.
Yes.
And that can be your fuel. And you don't notice that it took me 6 years to turn a profit. It took me 8 years to turn a profit over the poverty line. Yeah. I noticed that mathematically, but I wasn't deterred because I believe what I was doing was right.
Yeah.
And that's a really important piece. Yeah. And I don't want anyone to ever be discouraged by the millions of reasons why we should not be living our dreams. Mm-hmm. And those reasons are real. And if it's really your dream, it will continue to exist. This is the first time in my life I've ever had one job. And part of it is out of desperation and scrappiness, is that I've had to figure out how to make it work.
Yep.
So that's one thing. The second thing is those of you trying to do it, this one's shorter. I'm sorry I talk so much.
It's good.
The next one is that you are in charge of your own sense of urgency. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of businesses out there preying, with an E, not an A, on your vulnerability as a new entrepreneur, and they will convince you that everything is urgent. Mm-hmm. And the record, at least in my experience, it is urgent. Everything is urgent. But you have to move out of a job mindset into an entrepreneurial mindset to realize it's no longer about what's the number one priority today, because you have 98 of those.
Yes.
So it's more about, okay, well, what am I actually going to do today? And if you can control your own sense of urgency, you won't go into near as much debt.
Yep.
Don't walk around a conference with your credit card. Walk around the conference with your focus and what's important to you, because that will matter. Yeah. So those are my two pieces of advice.
I love that. And you've just demonstrated why you're such an effective and inspirational speaker in that. I think that you've shared a lot of great mentorship with the audience. And with that, I want to pivot and talk more about our rainbow family, and specifically your own LGBT identity and how that shows up in business. And I often like to ask guests to share some of the challenges and spend more time talking about our superpowers. So on the first point, I'm curious if you can share with us like a specific time where in your business, not working for someone else, you felt that you had to censor certain parts of yourself that relate to your sexual orientation, maybe your gender expression, and walk us through what that looked like and how you were able to work around it.
Sure. So because we haven't done this, I actually identify as a lesbian. I don't really like the word lesbian. I never have. It makes me feel, I don't know, old. Maybe I should start liking the word. So in identifying as a queer person, or I identify as a dyke, if I'm in a place where I'm allowed to identify as a dyke, which is very upsetting to some. And my identity in itself is upsetting to some, so we navigate language, right?
Totally.
I think that can come up as a pro and as a con. And I was saying before we started interviewing is that the older I get, the less sexual generally I get. So then my identities, because they're based on sexual orientation or sexual identity, that at least particular identity doesn't seem to matter or register in any way. So what's strange with that is that I remember when somebody came up to me and said, like, you are such an amazing ally. And they meant it as a compliment. And I am an ally to a lot of things, but they literally meant an ally to like the gay and lesbian community specifically. And I was just like, wow, this is what it feels like to be invisible, right?
Yeah,
like,
totally.
I think I'm as gay as a $3 bill, and I don't understand how on earth you cannot see that anymore. But that's where like ageism and sizeism and things like that come in, right?
Totally.
Then layer in, I've been married for over a decade, and I was legally married prior to gay marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So most of my queer friends and even queer clients that I was doing work with really had a hard time with me being straight married when I married a trans person. Mm-hmm. And the balance between having to constantly out my partner so that I could still be queer also put a strain on my personal relationship, but also puts a strain on my professional relationship. So then even today, over a decade later, I still have to decide if I'm in an audience and I'm the diversity hire, then I need to stay like as queer as possible. So I will mention my partner, but I try really hard not to say my husband. Right. Which I think also gets to like the invisibility of biphobia or things like if I identified as bisexual, that would be so amazing, but I don't, right? So yeah. I use the word partner to keep it queer. And then I actually talk about him all the time because I'm super duper in love with him because he's fabulous in every way. So then I can't always talk about him because when I'm perceived as a straight person, there's work that I have gotten that because I was perceived as straight, and then they actually asked me if I could throw in something LGBT related.
Wow.
But yes, I can handle that. So then one level deeper is just like my website or my marketing materials. I've tried really hard, especially with the pivot and the rebrand, to be as broad stroke as possible. One, because the deep dive stuff is burning me out. Mm-hmm. But in the broad stroke stuff, I tried really hard not to have things based on my individual identities. And I still have customers who are like, oh, she's too gay. I can't do this. And there's nothing on my website that even alludes to that.
Right.
So then on my site, when I tried to make it all broad stroke, people still saw the specific things that they thought would be either too controversial or too problematic. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, same website, there are people who saw it. Well, are you able to talk about racism? Mm-hmm. Like, we're kind of having this concern. I mean, do you know anyone else who can speak on that? And you're like, yes, just for you. I'll do both of those. That hasn't gotten any easier or any better in 15 years.
Yeah. I think it's really helpful just for you to kind of talk about your own experiences in this because of what I know about you, you know, like you're very publicly out, you know, if there's an opportunity to kind of talk about your world, you do. So there's definitely no shame around disclosing who you are. And yet there's still the realness of feeling invisible and also just trying to think about that purposeful disclosure, you know, like when you're up on a main stage and you're trying to make a point, there's all of that calculus that's probably going through your mind of like, okay, and this could be the part where I talk about my spouse, right? And do I out my spouse or do I put a gender on my spouse, right? And like, will I gain the audience in that way or do I lose them? I mean, there's so much to that. And I think for business owners broadly, that pops up all the time. I mean, you could be talking about clients, you're building relationships with them. Your sexual orientation, your gender identity hasn't necessarily come up. And inevitably there's the moments where you have that opportunity and what do you do with that? And it's different every time and there's no right or wrong way. It's just, it does at times, I mean, I can speak for myself, like putting on that censorship. I mean, for me, it's like, okay, am I straying away from the reason why I started this thing was to be more authentic in my work. So just thank you for being real on that because it is a challenge for all of us, no matter how long we've been out or the first time we came out or whatever that story is.
Well, and I think the real authentic part of it is that I'm still struggling with it.
Yeah.
You know, like I was just staying at a friend's house and they're lovely people and it was great. And they're, you know, artists and super inclusive and have millions of friends from all around the world, all these kind of things. And again, I talk about my husband constantly, whatever. And at one point in time at dinner last night, my friend's partner said my husband's name and then used the feminine pronoun for my husband. And there's a moment, like the educator that's like, oh, I should correct that. But there's also the individual part that, like, I am being read as a queer person.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's so nice.
Yeah.
So, like, a week ago, I was at a conference with like 3,000 attendees, and it was a more conservative conference. That's fine. I speak to conservative people all the time, but I'm always the wild card at those conferences, right?
Right.
And it was the first time in a long time that when I walked in the hotel, people wouldn't ride in an elevator with me. The evaluations were like scathing, and even worse things were said directly to the meeting planner's face. And so then I was like, oh my gosh, is this all like, the only point of reference I have is homophobia, right? Because I have so many dominant privileged identities. And that was because I was fat, tattooed, with hair dye, and super liberal.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Then they just assumed I was queer in some way. I'm sure they was the word lesbian, right? But so there are times where I'm navigating the censorship. Mm-hmm. There are times where buyers are navigating and censoring what I'm going to be like. And then there are times where that works in my favor. And there are times where it doesn't. That's the real authentic part, is that sometimes it's the same thing when I tell people that I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer, mm-hmm. is that I learned really quickly. You don't tell people I had a washing machine, like my school was closed most of the time. I traveled around Eastern Europe and lived in Turkey for 6 months. You don't say that part. Right. You let them say that I taught English to goats in the snow and I'm scrappy and resourceful because of it. So if their assumptions and their story makes it better, then you just ride that out. And if it doesn't, then you have to constantly correct it or figure out how to present yourself in a way that does navigate it. And that is a really disingenuous process. Yeah. But that's the authentic process.
Right. Right. Thank you for walking through that. I think that's really, really helpful. And the show is about empowerment. I like to shine a light on the superpowers that allows us to stand out. And so I'm really curious from your perspective, considering your lived experiences of being a part of the Rainbow family, when you think about those experiences and you're in the business world, right? You're building this awesome business. What are some of those lived experiences that you view as superpowers, for lack of a better way of describing it, that allows you to really shine and be more authentic and to be that business that your clients are like, we're going with Jess? Like, what are some of those powers that you see?
First off, it's a fabulous question. So keep that question. Yeah. And I think that if you pair that kind of authentic struggle dance that I was just describing, mm-hmm. and you pair that with my self-assessment, self-work, responsibility piece, and then like a Venn diagram, the third oval is that I really do try to draw attention to the people who are not being heard. Not just the underdogs, because they're not always underdogs. They're just being ignored or overlooked or left out or not sitting at the table in the first place. Yep. I think what ends up happening is that from my own, you use the word censorship, but like my own shifting or code switching, covering of things, I can use those examples with that language and watch people in the room like, oh, she gets it. Mm-hmm. She knows that I'm somebody else at home, right? Yep. Or that I'm somebody else as soon as I clock out of here. And the reality is that we bring all that secret stuff to work with us. If we haven't named it, they've named it. They've come up with whatever that's about, whether they know the truth or not. And so I think that allows a space for people's truths or narratives to at least come out to me individually. So then I'm working with much more of a reality-based culture than just like what I'm being presented. It gives permission for that realness to come out.
Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting. And so, and maybe I'm not getting this. So like, because we have covered or we have censored ourselves in some ways, you're saying that one of your superpowers is to kind of see when other folks from different identity groups maybe or marginalized groups are doing that in order to try to pass or to try to have access or a seat at the table, that you're trying to create that space. Am I getting that right? Or
I mean, sort of, yeah. So first off, I think that because I know I'm doing it, I'm making the assumption every single other person in this meeting is doing that for something.
Yep. Yeah.
Right. Not that they're betraying me or lying, but they're code switching and figuring out what they feel safe sharing.
I see.
Which means that the opposite of that is there's some stuff they're not sharing that they don't feel ready for. So like I just did a training the other day, and I was talking about, we were having people like name things that came up in their lives. And so then when I was processing it, I just said, like, I want to first honor everything that got named. And in doing that activity, you pulled up things into your mind that you then did not share, but they have now been named, just no one else knows what they are. Yeah. But those deserve attention too, because you edited not to say them.
Yeah.
And then when I said that, this room was like I could, oh, could she hear what's going on in my head? And I can't hear what's going on in your head, but I can empathize and provide space for the truth that's going on in your head.
Yeah.
And then now our conversation's gotten to a different level without you having to disclose stuff you're not safe to disclose.
Yep.
And I don't know that would happen if I didn't know I was also doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like a litmus test for you. It's like, if I am doing these things, it's probably happening in this space. And so I'm just going to kind of call it out in a way that will bring people in, right? Or calling in. I don't. Yeah. Thank you for walking me through that, because I agree. I think that definitely is a skill that many of us have, even if we haven't named it or thought through it as thoughtfully as you have. That's definitely helpful.
I also get, like, when you're doing consulting work or something, I bet this happens to you too, is you get like the list of the staff members. And then the person who hired you, I always ask them, like, give me the list, but then like, give me your little take on them.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is that I ask everybody for their little take on everybody.
Yep.
And then there's this consistent narrative about that person in the office that may or may not be remotely accurate.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
And so then it tells me about the person who's telling me their narrative of other people than it does just that other person.
Yeah.
So then it's my responsibility to hold what other people are saying and versus what they're saying, and bridge that gap when I'm trying to give advice or shift office culture or something like that.
Yeah. I think that's also really helpful. It's a kind of like a covert 360 of people and like what's really happening in that space. And it allows you just to do your work.
That's my super skill, right? Is that if you ask everyone to do a 360, they're only going to share the stuff they feel like they can share without too much risk.
Yeah, and they're doing that in confidence with you, and you're hanging on to that in a thoughtful way. So one more question for you, and then we're going to jump into the bonus round. And so this question is more considering some of the challenges that you've named and this kind of like superpower of just kind of spidey sense of what's happening in the room with different players. Like, what do you want our listeners to take away from this conversation in particular to inspire them to be more authentic in their work, whether they're working for themselves or they're working for someone else at this point?
Yeah. So one of the things I was really drawn to in a number of your interviews I've listened to is the concept of being out has been like cannibalized in so many ways. And there's all this kind of pressure around it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that there's one that's right. And I don't know that there's one that's wrong. And I think it's important to just name that it's a thing.
Yes.
It's a thing. And when you make a choice, you're not stuck to that choice. You get to remake a choice.
Yeah.
Part of coming out as anything. I mean, the original, when you named my first business, I Am Social Justice, that was actually from the very first program I did when I worked at NYU for National Coming Out Day. I printed out stickers that said, I am ...
Yeah, I remember that.
Everybody is something. And so then you pick and choose when to come out as gluten intolerant or left-handed or secretly really into the WWF, right? like who knows? Who knows what kind of interesting things are happening, right? That someone's moonlighting as a jazz singer and they're an accountant, right? Like, that can happen.
Totally.
So if we understand that the humanity involved and what it takes to share what you are with someone else and risk the rejection of that coming up against the story the other person has about you, we're all doing that. And there are times where I think visibility is really important. And there are times where visibility of this takes away from visibility of this.
Yes.
And if you're being visible and you come out and you're visible as that thing, it is your job to remember that not everyone feels comfortable coming out.
Yep.
As anything. So then what can you do if you have the space to be visible and out and comfortable, or that power dynamic is in your favor? What can you do for the folks that aren't in that light?
Yeah.
Because they're still there.
Yep.
They're just not able to share that piece of them.
Yeah.
If you can keep that, then I think not only is it, not to do a play on words, but not only is that going to help people come out, but it's also more entrepreneurial in the sense that it allows people to be creative and innovative and seen as whole team members,
yes.
even if the whole team member really is only putting forth an eighth of themselves because that's what they feel safe to do.
Yeah.
Great. I welcome that eighth. Thank you.
Yeah.
Now let's get to work.
Right. Right. I think that's really valuable advice, is that I think it just goes back to what you said before, where there's really no right way of being out, coming out, but just kind of like being, I guess this is my woo side, but just being more gentle with yourself around like what small step, like what 1/8 of a step could you maybe take just to feel a little more authentic in what you're doing, right? And only you can be the judge of that, of what risk you want to kind of take at that given moment, right?
And moment to moment and moment to moment and moment to moment.
Totally. It's not static, for sure. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a really quick sponsorship break, and then we're going to go back into the bonus round.
Dun, 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 dun.
Yes. What does it look like for you to be the true leader, the outboss you know you can be? That's a question David DiGiorgio, friend of the show, takes seriously. He is on a mission to empower high achievers, outbosses, to become visionary leaders and speakers. In his upcoming book, Being Unapologetic, David shares his story of being severely bullied in school and how he's used that as the foundation for his success and is now on a mission to support you in sharing your message and voice with the world. When you pre-order the special, limited edition, not only will a portion of your purchase support a high school performing arts program, you and your story will be featured to inspire others. You're ready to be unapologetic now. To learn more, visit outboss.beingunapologetic.com. Again, that's outboss.beingunapologetic.com. Aspiring outbosses, are you struggling with taking that first entrepreneurial leap? Does the imposter syndrome prevent you from getting started? Have you considered seeking support, but you're just not sure where to turn? Look no further. The Out Entrepreneur now offers a coaching and mentorship program where you can access support and strategies to shift your mindset from employee to entrepreneur. If you're looking for accountability and a mentor who successfully busted out of the 9-to-5 lifestyle, let's schedule a time to talk today. Visit www.outentrepreneur.com and look for show notes from today's episode to schedule a call. Again, the URL is www.outentrepreneur.com. Together, let's welcome you to the wonderful world of being an outboss. All right, welcome back, outbosses. We are now going into our bonus round where we're going to have the chance to get to know Jess just a little bit better, gain some insights on how we can bring our whole selves to work, and then learn one way to stay in touch with Jess after today's conversation. All right, Jess, are you ready?
Bring it on.
Okay, here we go. Okay, so do you have a mantra, a quote, or something that you reference that helps you stay motivated in your business when things get tough?
Literally the subtitle of my book.
Yes.
Doing the best we can with what we got some of the time.
Yes, I love it.
So I break it into 3 different pieces. Every once in a while, one piece resonates a little bit more. But generally, when I'm like, screw it, I'll get a job at Starbucks. And then I realize no one at Starbucks would ever hire me. I go back to doing the best I can with what I have some of the time.
Yeah. I love it. It reminds me of basic goodness in Buddhism, where it's like, you're good right now. You're good. And just keep going. Okay. So do you have a personal habit that helps you master yourself and your business?
Master myself?
Master yourself.
I guess the biggest habit is that I am a disaster and I'm the best tool I've got going.
I love
right?
it.
So I feel like I do a lot of work around what kind of disaster am I? The only other thing I can think of that's a little bit more tangible is that as someone who says I'm not woo-woo, but I am surrounded by woo-woo people constantly, is hi. So when I find some new woo-woo thing that I've never heard of, I give myself 6 months to do it.
Whoa, I love it. So,
I have gone camping with strangers at the bottom of Mount Whistler for a week where I did yoga at the bottom of a mountain. I've gone to silent retreats. I have floated in salt water in the dark. I have done all of the things, except not all the things because I'm still learning of new things. But I give myself 6 months. Like, I have to do it.
Nice. I love that. And that allows you to keep learning, right? So,
yeah.
Okay. So what's one thing?
And not just learning the new thing, but realizing that new things are scary and they're all scary in a very similar way.
Yep.
And if you just do them, you can still be scared of them, but you just do them. It's like fear factor. Like all those weird things everybody ate, they can't kill you because that would be bad for the show.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. Okay. So what's one thing that you readily delegate in your business to stay focused on what you're good at?
Regularly delegate everything that is super detail oriented.
Yeah.
So like buying my travel, I will buy a plane ticket for the wrong year. Invoicing, ordering books that need to be mailed to the correct address. I love a good spreadsheet, but if it could be put into a spreadsheet and do it, I delegate to someone else.
Nice.
I speak and write.
Good.
That's what I do.
I love it. I love it. It's a good reminder for all of us. Just like delegate as much as you can. If you're going in alone as a solopreneur, find software to help you out along the way. Just practice it. It works.
Yeah. Well, and I would say if you're new to this, like pick the thing that you suck at right now and outsource that.
Yep.
And then as you make more money, you can outsource more things you suck at.
Yes.
But eventually you still have to pay attention to all of them, even if you're outsourcing them.
Yep. Exactly. Okay. So last two questions. And this
Not
one,
like I'm talking too much.
No, this one is probably the hardest out of all of them. Can you share one piece of advice to inspire the next generation of outbosses to take that first entrepreneurial leap?
No.
That's an answer. No. Yeah, it's very honest.
No, I can't. And there's too many like tear off calendars, right? Like go buy one of those. The best thing I could say to someone who's contemplating this is that we all think we're nuts. And I don't have to go to a staff meeting with people I don't want to talk to anymore.
Yes. Love it. That's motivation right there. So
yeah. May 14th, 2006 was my last meeting with a human being I had no interest in talking to.
Wow.
That wasn't paying me to meet with them.
Yes. Yeah. That's powerful. That's very powerful. So just let that sink in. Okay. Last question for you. Number one, thank you. Thank you for being on the show. I'm going to have you back because there was like an entire section of the interview that we just didn't get to because you were sharing so much wisdom. So look out for that invite in several months. But before we go, can you share one way that we can stay in touch with you and learn more about your business?
Yeah, absolutely. Also, happy Pride Month because it's June. The best way to stay in touch with me is Jess at goodenoughnow.com. And then I give out a texting number to anyone and everyone. So if you ever have any thoughts, comments, questions, the texting number is 202-670-4262. 202-670-4262. The only warning I give you is that if you ask me, I will answer you.
I love it. You're going to get nothing but honesty. So beware. All right, cool. We will include that in the show notes. So Jess, it's just a privilege connecting with you. And for Outbosses, thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. It's always a privilege to connect with you all as well. And I just feel really, really inspired. So for details from today's conversation, definitely check out our show notes. You can find them at www.outentrepreneur.com. As a next step, consider subscribing to the podcast, leaving a rating and review in iTunes. That helps get the show known and out there. And definitely be sure to share it with a friend or a loved one. And for now, keep being your authentic selves 100% of the time.